I'm now going to go through the differences between what are objects and complements. These get confused because they're both part of a verb in one sense. In other words, that they can be part of a sentence and are connected to the verb. But one of them comes up with certain types of action verbs, and the other one comes up with all linking verbs. Okay? So objects are part of certain action verbs. They're not absolutely necessary whenever there's an action verb. They're only necessary with certain types of action verbs. Complements are part of all linking verbs. Always linking verbs have complements. Okay? So I'll go through the differences here and how they work and how one works as opposed to the other. So action verbs can have objects. They don't necessarily need to have them always. What there are within action verbs, there are certain types of action verbs, transitive and intransitive. It's not so important to understand transitive or intransitive, but understand that transitive verbs will take objects. Okay? It's when you do something to something. That something that gets acted upon is the object. That something that gets acted upon is the object of that action verb. It's not part of the verb itself. It's what gets acted upon. So you wouldn't want to underline it as part of the verb itself. It instead is the object of that verb. It's what the verb hits and acts upon. With linking verbs, they have a complement. And it's important to understand the nature of this word. It's not complement as in, boy, your hair looks nice today kind of complement. It's complement as complete. It completes the linking verb. It's not part of the linking verb, but it completes the linking verb logic. It's the be in the A equals B behind the linking verb. It has to be there. That linking verb has to act as a link between the A and the B, and that B must be there. The complement completes the linking verb logic. It has to link onto something. It's not part of the verb, but it must be there. It has to hit that other side. Okay? So linking verbs always have complements. Action verbs sometimes have objects, sometimes they don't. Depends on whether or not you have a transitive or intransitive verb. Now to see some of this logic, this is again in some simple examples. You can see how it works. Desiree kicked the ball. Well, Desiree is our subject here. The action is kicked. It's an action verb. It could have an object or it could not. Well, she is kicking something. She's kicking the ball. That is the object. That's what's getting kicked. It's not part of the verb, but it is the object of the verb. So in a real sense, that object belongs to the verb. It's what gets kicked. So this is your verb, this is your subject, and this is your object. Okay? Now the next one is Albert laughed, as simple of a sentence as you can get. Albert is your subject. Laughed is your verb, clearly. And you don't laugh something. You don't laugh a joke. You don't laugh the way you kick a ball. Okay? So this is what's called an intransitive verb. It's an intransitive verb. It's not taking an object. It doesn't need to. Some verbs and action verbs, and this isn't so important to get down just to write well, some verbs absolutely must have an object. Sometimes some verbs can have an object and sometimes they don't have an object. Sometimes verbs really can't have an object at all. I don't really go into the nuances, but I just want you to be aware of it. Objects belong to action verbs. Objects belong to action verbs. They don't necessarily have to be there. They could be there, they might not be there. Okay? Now, here we have Filbert became class president. Became is a linking verb. So the logic of this sentence is going to work differently. Became, as you can recognize, is a fairly common verb. Most linking verbs are. Filbert is your subject. That's really your A. Your verb here is became, that's your equals. Your B here is really this whole noun phrase. This is an adjective class modifying president, your noun. So this is your noun phrase that operates as if it's just one noun, and that's your B. So that operates as one single unit. That is your complement. It completes your subject. In other words, A equals B, you must have that B there. You can't just have A equals blank. You can't do that. Instead, you have to complete it. Always linking verbs must have some complement, some completion here to finish off their logic. That's the class president. That's your B. So that's the difference between an object and a complement. Objects are part of action verbs. They don't always have to be there. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. Depends on the nature of the verb. We won't go into that with this class. With complements, they're part of linking verbs. They do have to be there. They're not part of the verb itself, but they're part of the logic of a linking verb. They must finish off the linking verb clause. They must be there at the end. Okay? So that's the distinction between them. And if you get that down, you're going to get down the differences between action and linking verbs. Then you really understand that linking verbs are quite different from action verbs. And all verbs aren't actions, so they are quite different. Okay? All right, take care.